This is Andy in Toy Story 1, and this is Andy in Toy Story 4. The new Andy's skin and movements are smooth, while old Andy is robotic and wears a stiff shirt. Pixar has made giant leaps from their first film in 1995 to their newest release. From major advancements in how they animate humans to the clothes those humans wear. We start with the way Pixar perfected realistic movement for characters of all kinds.
This is a shot from Pixar's Soul. Even though it's animated, everything about how the fingers float from one key to another, to the small details like tendons moving in the hand, feels just as real as the reference footage that inspired it. While Pixar has used reference footage since the beginning, it could not have pulled off a scene with movement this nuanced and realistic back in 1995 for Toy Story. And it took years of technological breakthroughs. So how did Pixar get here? First off, they have an army of animators and riggers. We talked to 7 who worked on Soul to see how far Pixar has come. Let's start over 26 years ago, with the technology built for Toy Story. Getting a given character to move starts in Pixar's rigging and modeling department.
Whenever you're thinking of a character model before it's rigged, it's in a completely neutral pose. There's no expression on the face. The arms and legs are all straight. And so the controls that we put in rigging lets parts of the body move like you would pose like a doll or a puppet.
To get a clearer idea of the basics, let's start with this character model of Woody. The rigging department will add the rig, which is essentially an inner skeleton. Throughout this rig, you can see all these controls called animated variables, or AVARs, which animators use to make different parts of a character move around. This early version of Woody had 596 of those controls, which may seem like a lot, but by 2019's Toy Story 4, Woody had more than 7,000. To make things a little more complicated, one control point is often connected to other control points, so moving one in the eyebrow will move the wrinkles on the forehead. Adding more controls to these Toy Story characters would have let them move with more nuance. But back then, Pixar was making a brand new rig for every single character. That would change with Toy Story 2. Pixar introduced Geppetto, later updated to Presto, which allowed animators to reuse and adapt rigs for multiple characters. This sped up the animation process and gave animators more control over movements and facial expressions. The new software provided a template of 2-legged and 4-legged rigs that could be altered depending on the specific needs of the character. According to rigger Jared Fong, the sea lions in Finding Dory were actually constructed from dog rigs, with legs folded into flippers. More control with Geppetto also meant more expressive facial movements, as seen in 2003's Finding Nemo. To really nail the character's emotions, animators used reference footage. Now, fish don't have eyebrows or eyelids, but eyebrows are so important for expressing human emotions. So animators decided to add eyebrow-like lumps to characters like Marlin and Dory. And replicating real facial expressions meant connecting more control points with each other. You can see that with Dory. The control points around her mouth are connected with her eyes and her cheeks, giving her a more believable smile. A smize, if you will. After making major strides with toys and sea creatures, the most daunting challenge was yet to come: humans. Mr. Incredible consisted of 426 primary controls, 111 secondary animation controls for more subtle movements, and 1,061 modeling controls for sizing and other adjustments. Thanks to Geppetto, the rigging and modeling team could perfect Mr. Incredible and then reuse his rig for other characters. And to really make his movements realistic, they used full-body reference footage. For example, this clip where an animator lifts up this exercise ball was helpful for moments like this, where Mr. Incredible lifts up an Omnidroid. And the team didn't animate just a rigid skeleton. On top of the skeleton was a layer of muscles, which could bulge and flex, and the skin on top of that would need to respond realistically. So Pixar developed a new system called Goo. This allowed the animators to see the skin and muscles react in real time as they work, allowing for greater flexibility in movement and more control over how humans move. Goo led to breakthroughs in moving more challenging body parts, like the shoulders, which were more primitive in earlier films.
So Buzz Lightyear's shoulder is a ball and socket. Woody's shoulder is just a stitch line. He's got no shoulders, right? That arm just hinges. Mr. Incredible has a big, old, strong shoulder, how you get a trapezius muscle there in the shoulder, and how it moves into the pectoral, and really complex stuff.
The rigs built for The Incredibles were designed to let the characters stretch further than the average human, which was important for Elastigirl, who needed to transform into all shapes and sizes. And just like how superheroes needed to react to forces like gravity, so too did the cars in Pixar's next feature, Cars. Pixar extended its technological boundaries yet again with a system called ground locking, which made sure the cars always stayed on the same path, regardless of terrain, without animators having to move them frame by frame.
We had to have our characters be able to follow the contours of the ground without having to animate them, like up and down if it was like a rolling hill. So it's going to move along these things, and then we're going to animate on top of that.
Because of ground locking, Lightning McQueen could now drive smoothly on a flat road that turns into a very windy path automatically. This may seem like a specific advancement just for the Cars movies, but it would be important for some of the most memorable characters in Soul. By 2007, animators could have up to 150 controls in the human face, so they could give characters a much wider range of emotion. Perfect for a movie like Ratatouille, which is largely set in the human world. All these intricate controls allowed for the complex array of expressions seen on Chef Skinner. Look at how far Chef Skinner's mouth extends as he's yelling at Linguini. According to supervising animator Mark Walsh, the tech wouldn't have been able to handle such a stretch in Toy Story or Finding Nemo. The groundbreaking muscle work in The Incredibles allowed animators to give Linguini more spontaneous movements in the scenes where he's controlled by Remy in the kitchen. By the time Toy Story 3 came out in 2010, Pixar's animators had gotten such precise control over how characters move that it's surprising they'd want to take a step backward. But they actually relied on fewer controls to better replicate the trademark toy movements audiences knew and loved.
If a character has a limited range of motion in its shoulder, what we'll do is we'll basically lock off some of that range of motion, and then that forces you to animate it in a different way.
They still had room to pick and choose what they would keep about the old characters and where to elevate them. For example, they could have put 25 controls in each of Buzz's eyebrows, but decided to keep them simple, like when he had just 3 per brow in the original, while also giving Spanish Buzz these complicated flamenco-like moves. There was one particularly hard toy to animate, the octopus named Stretch. Despite the innovations and stretchiness from The Incredibles, making 8 tentacles stretch and curl was still a daunting task.
We're fighting against the computer. The computer wants to make things that are solid, that are perfect.
But it was a challenge they would eventually master in Finding Dory. The hardest part of an octopus to replicate is the tentacles, which need to bend, curl, and unfurl. You can see early attempts at this with Stretch and this octopus-like monster all the way back in Monsters, Inc. In Finding Dory, Hank also needed to move around quite a bit and grab onto things, like this coffee pot. Hank also had more than 350 suckers combined on his tentacles. Those were so unpredictable that they had to be simulated, a process where movements are automated using code, like with strands of hair and clothing. The tentacles themselves were so dynamic that when one moved, it would move other parts of Hank's body as well. And animators used an altered version of this tentacle rig on Dante in Coco, giving the dog a long, twisty tongue. You can see it grab onto objects here in the short film Dante's Lunch. But the biggest challenge for Coco was music. Pixar had to figure out how to get Miguel to accurately play guitar. So they strapped GoPros directly to guitars, giving themselves the closest possible angle. They would listen to the guitar music and mimic the exact finger and string movements. It looks so authentic, but Pixar found it could push this even further and make playing music look even more real in 2020's Soul. As with previous Pixar films, some assets were reused from Coco. For example, the same rig built for the Coco guitars was repurposed for Miho's bass.
We modified it for 4 strings and just kind of repositioned it to work for that.
But for the scenes where Joe plays piano, they went far beyond just matching the music directly to audio. For reference footage, Pixar captured John Batiste playing piano at multiple angles. Then, character technical director Jason Davies and the rigging team built a piano rig, which functions like a digital piano. Davies fed the audio files directly into the rig, and the piano would play automatically in time with the music. If a key lit up blue, the animators would place Joe's left hand there, and his right hand would be placed on any key that turned red. They also tried developing a simulation for Joe's piano playing, but it proved tricky, as his finger was too heavy on the small piano keys. So Davies developed a finger contact rig similar to one used on Coco. Just like in Coco, where fingers moved the strings on guitars, Dorothea's fingers could play the saxophone, and most importantly, Joe could play the piano.
When their fingers would intersect the space where a key was, so it pushes down into the keyboard, it would calculate the proper angle that that piano key needed to rotate to make it look like he's pushing it.
While the piano played on its own, the hands still needed to capture the complicated motions of playing, which is why Joe was equipped with 292 controls in each of his hands. That's about half the amount of controls in Woody's entire body in the first Toy Story. The riggers added variables to Joe's hand that they had never used before. According to character model lead Mara McMahon, the team even added a control for each tendon in Joe's hands.
But that was something that could kind of capture the tension in his hands as he's playing the piano. So there's a control for each hand just to make a tendon appear if the animator wanted to really emphasize that particular pose.
These state-of-the-art hand and wrist controls weren't just useful for playing music. They also allowed for flexibility. Like Linguini and Ratatouille, Joe is tall and lanky and has a lot of frenzied movements that had to be highlighted in scenes where he is inhabited by 22. For all this, Joe had 477 controls in his face and 789 additional controls throughout his entire body, giving him 1,266 controls total. Conversely, they limited the movements on Dorothea to show her regal stature. They even went as far as removing subtle blinks and nods.
It's all in the look, how they, hold their head up and how they just set their gaze upon whatever they're looking at.
But sometimes it's the simplest looking actions or characters that prove the hardest to control. Take the counselors. They look like simple 2D lines, but they were the most complicated characters to animate.
Doing the counselor characters for Soul was pushing our limits of what we could do, and it turned out amazing. That's building on 25, 26 years of history to get to that point.
Terry consisted of around 300 controls. A new tension control allowed animators to sharpen or add an angle by assigning it a higher value. This allowed Terry and the Jerrys to randomly grow fingers off their hands. Plus, they were able to easily transition between Terry's multiple forms using just a few controls, pivotal in scenes where Terry mutates into objects on Earth, like this handrail or this bag of chips. But of course, even something so new and unusual couldn't have been made without looking to Pixar's past. The stretchy software that built Hank and Dante's tongue allowed Terry to disguise herself in elaborate ways, like in this heart monitor and this brick wall. And the counselors couldn't just move the way a person could, posing another major challenge.
Since they don't have legs, right, they just slide around on the ground. The closest analogy was actually cars and that kind of stuff.
That meant they needed to borrow from the same ground-locking technology pioneered in Cars to keep the counselors in motion. When you get so good at making things move realistically, it's okay to sometimes let your imagination run wild.
We're not trying to make things look necessarily perfectly real. What we're trying to do is make sure that the emotions that are coming out of the characters and what they're thinking feel 100% real.
Just as movement was becoming more sophisticated, so were human characters, which in the early days Pixar used to keep hidden. Humans have always been a challenging obstacle for Pixar, and getting from 1995's Andy to where we are today took its animators years and countless simulations to master all the elements that make up a person: hair, skin, and muscles. When Pixar embarked on its first feature-length film, it still had work to do to figure out how to make 3D animated human characters. When animators tried, some of their digital models came out stiff, so they came up with some creative solutions where they could. Lighting was one clever way to hide those imperfections, shrouding human characters in darkness, like in this scene at Pizza Planet. But in order to avoid showing bodies completely, they staged mini shots so you could only see feet and hands, like this shot of Andy's mom walking in the room. Creating a variety of different people of all shapes and sizes, and especially the clothes that they would wear, was especially time-consuming. So instead of customizing every individual, they Frankensteined it. copying body parts from some humans and creating new humans out of those parts, while changing little bits and pieces of their physical appearance. But even in that first feature film, they did have an early breakthrough. Animators needed to distinguish between the look of the toys and the look of the humans. One way to do this was through movement. Head animator Pete Docter observed, for example, that Woody was floppy and loose, therefore he would have quicker movements. On the other hand, humans were bigger and heavier, meaning they had to slow their movements down. 1997's Jerry's Game was the first Pixar project to feature a human character as its lead. This 4.5-minute short was basically an experiment. One of the most prominent features to focus on for Jerry was his skin. Human skin needs to be smooth. Prior to Jerry's Game, human models were built in patches. Skin sometimes came out looking more plastic. This is where math came to the rescue. Enter the subdivision technique, which is when an animator subdivides a hard-edged shape enough times that it becomes a soft and smooth surface. Thanks to subdivision, Jerry's hand looks much smoother, like a human hand should. This method has been used on every Pixar movie since, smoothing out everything from humans to bugs to buildings. That work allowed Andy and the rest of the human characters to spend less time in the shadows in 1999's Toy Story 2. Another tool that pulled humans out of the shadows was a Render Man shader. This let animators paint on details to the basic character renderings, like pores, veins, and blotches. There is no better example of this advance than toy collector Al. You can see the skin imperfections on his face, and even a 5 o'clock shadow. And this shader tool would be used all the time. It's how they made sure Mama Coco had such distinct facial details compared to other characters in Coco. But we didn't see that until 2017. At the precipice of the new millennium, Pixar was inching closer to giving animated humans even more screen time. There were still a few hoops to jump through, which you can see in 2001's Monsters, Inc. One of the biggest issues with human characters continued to be their clothes. Boo, the movie's only human character, wears a big flowy shirt. Prior to Monsters, Inc., characters wore clothes that moved automatically with them. A new simulator, called Fizz-T, enabled them to animate Boo and her shirt separately. Look at how much more natural the movement of Boo's shirt looks compared to Sid's sister's shirt in this moment from Toy Story, where the shirt barely moves as she does. And while Fizz-T allowed for both better clothing and all the fur you see on Sully, it couldn't do everything. Director Pete Docter wanted to give Boo long hair, but to do that, the animators would have had to animate in pieces instead of in one block. So to save them the trouble, they gave her pigtails instead, which were easier to manage. Now that Pixar could create skin and make clothes move, it was time to make a feature-length movie entirely populated by human characters in the form of 2004's The Incredibles. One of the first tasks? Conquering long hair. Director Brad Bird insisted Violet have the long hair that Boo didn't have. Animators already had to deal with a lot of hair collisions on a normal head of hair, so you can imagine how much they dealt with it for Violet, especially with how many different situations she finds herself in, and all the times she plays with her hair. The team developed a core simulation engine that handled all the collisions caused by long hair while keeping it moving and flowing, as well as the tools that gave animators more control over the placement and velocity of her hair. Figuring out how to properly animate and then render Violet's signature hair took 6 months of work. But Violet wasn't the only character pushing the way Pixar physically builds humans. Mr. Incredible is all muscle, and none of Pixar's human characters resembled him. For that reason, animators used a software called Goo, which allows the skin to react to moving and sliding muscles, making a character's movement look a lot more natural. While many of the developments created for the making of The Incredibles were specific for certain characters, the studio wasn't done perfecting the look of human skin. See, Human skin is actually somewhat transparent. Some light needs to go through the skin, scatter around, and then reflect back. If the skin looks too solid and no light gets in, it won't look natural. So animators used subsurface scattering to render skin. With subsurface scattering applied, skin no longer just looked like a rigid surface. They actually found inspiration for the skin in an unlikely place. The tools used to make the Finding Nemo fish look translucent were used to scatter light off the skin of humans here. But with these advancements, the studio never forgot that the skin couldn't look too realistic. Despite the capabilities that the shader and the subsurface scattering now allowed, if a human were to look too real, then they would enter into the realm of the disturbing uncanny valley. So while details like follicles and pores could have been added, they were purposely left out. Pixar has been able to build convincing humans that don't follow all the basic rules of human anatomy throughout the years. For example, Carl Fredricksen from 2009's Up. His head was deliberately designed to have massive, boxy proportions, and instead of adding every tiny skin detail, they focused on the most defining wrinkles in an old man's face. Skin and bone aren't the only things that make up a human. Pixar constantly strived to make humans more expressive. By the time Ratatouille was in the works, Pixar would have 150 controls just on a character's face. These controls allowed for the varying movement speeds between toys and humans in Toy Story and got even more sophisticated over the years, granting animators the ability to slow down and minimize the movements of an elderly character like Carl in Up. Control points also allow for the complex expressions of a character like Chef Skinner, as well as more subtle and varied body motions, like Linguini's slapstick movements. Meanwhile, Violet's long hair paved the way for Colette, who had 176,030 hairs on her head. Advanced simulations had to be applied to make sure strands would not merge into each other. Despite the sophistication of Colette's hair, Pixar still had hair challenges, specifically mastering curly hair. According to Pixar's Chief Technology Officer Steve May, curly hair needs to be soft while still holding a curly shape. So in 2009, simulation supervisor Claudia Chung and her team developed a new simulator called Taz for 2012's Brave, which built Merida's hair as coil-like locks to imitate the movement of real curly hair. But the curls would completely unwind, so the animators added invisible core springs underneath them, allowing the locks to move with more control. The better Pixar's animators got at creating humans, the easier it was for them to play around with their form and literally deconstruct them. 2017's Coco features a cast of skeleton characters that were based on humans. Animators were able to use the same rigs they would use for humans covered in flesh and muscle, but with some changes, as the bones needed to move in ways that you wouldn't normally see in human characters. For one, the skeletons were able to detach their bones, so the rigs were altered to allow for this. A tool called Kingpin made the bones appear looser by adding jiggle to them, which you can see here. Pixar then put all the skin and muscle back on for Incredibles 2, a sequel 14 years in the making. Even with all the strides made back in 2004 with the first Incredibles, there was still so much more that Brad Bird and the animation team wanted to improve on. When the first movie came out, they didn't have the ability to get every single detail from the original clay sculpts of the characters. Now they could. Just look at the difference between Jack in the two movies. This is partially because, for the first time ever, Pixar was able to base the characters' eyes off real human eyes. Sure, the eyes are still bigger and more stylized than normal, but just look at this shot of Dash. The eyes are less circular and more of an oval when opened wide. Meanwhile, creating and rendering Violet's long hair was easier now than it was in 2004, and even more free-flowing here. And speaking of hair, there were further hair breakthroughs. In the past, animators would only be able to work with scant guide strands of hairs, just guessing what the finalized hair would look like. That would have made it tough to animate Elastigirl on her motorcycle as her hair flows in the wind, or Violet blow-drying her hair. But now, animators had full access to what these characters' hair would look like at every stage of production before rendering, allowing them to sculpt better hairstyles and even catch mistakes early on. Another subtle difference between the two Incredibles movies: in Incredibles 2, the city streets are more heavily populated. According to producer Nicole Paradis Grindle, Bird thought the urban backdrops looked too sparse during major moments. Crowds are hard, as you have to animate, simulate, and render a lot of individual people. So the crowds team actually started using some motion capture. It was used in Coco on some background skeletons, and made way for better filming of background humans in Incredibles 2. You can really see just how far human animation had come by the time Toy Story 4 rolled around just by looking in the background. Bonnie's kindergarten class is more fully realized than the dark pizza planet or even Andy's birthday party from the first movie. You can see characters with long hair, and even in this shot from a toy's perspective, all the human faces are clearly seen. And they continued to successfully experiment with motion capture in order to populate the film's carnival scenes. What difference does mocap make? Well, according to Toy Story 4 Crowds lead Neil Helm, this technology can make human background characters more convincing and detailed. Crowd characters tend to run on looping cycles. Mocap lets filmmakers capture much longer clips of background characters carrying out distinct actions. From subdivision surfaces to hair-bending simulations to breakthroughs in cloth and realistic crowds, mastering the elements of human beings allowed Pixar to populate its worlds and expand the kinds of stories it was able to tell. And most importantly, animators know when to give characters enough detail that they seem human, but enough exaggeration in their form that they're still part of an animated universe. More advanced simulation technology meant Pixar could perfect things like hair and fur, but mastering clothing provided its own set of challenges.
From their first animated short in 1997 to Onward in 2020, Pixar has evolved a lot. Animals look more real. We went from smooth fur to seeing every moving strand, and human characters went from stiff to natural and cute. But there's another area of innovation that you might not have noticed in the 25 years Pixar's been around: clothes. The studio has come a long way since the suit jacket in 1997's Jerry's Game. Such a long way that an entire character in 2020's Onward is just made of a pair of pants. To see just how far they've brought their cloth technology, you just have to look at how they animated the dad in Onward. A central character in a Pixar movie will have their clothing built from scratch, starting with a whole set of sketches and concept art. This design stage is especially important when the costume figures prominently into the story, as Dad's does in Onward. The film's premise is that these brothers use a magic spell to connect with their late father, but are only able to conjure up the bottom half of him, his pants. They improvise an upper half for their dad out of an old sweatshirt, some pillow stuffing, gloves, and a trucker hat, which meant all of this had to seem thrown together, but in a funny, endearing way.
He needs to be appealing, right? We need to believe both that you could be a sweatshirt, but maybe from the squinting out of the corner of your eye, like, oh, that might be a real person.
Once the character's wardrobe is designed, all the art reference gets handed over to Pixar's character tailoring artists, who basically act as digital tailors for the film. It's their job to worry about every single piece of clothing you see in a movie like Onward. Their first task is to bring the clothes into virtual form by modeling them in the computer. They build a 3D shape, or model, of each garment, then fit it onto the character model, also known as the skin. As part of the fitting process, they'll take the character through a series of animated poses to see how the clothing fits. This is where things got tricky with Dad. His lower body was like a traditional character. There was an animated skin underneath those pants, but his upper half was supposed to be made of cloth and stuffing, with no skin or bodily structure underneath it. Here's where the next stage, simulation, came in. Simulation is a way to automate the movement of elements like clothing, fur, and hair that would take too long to animate by hand.
Pixar first used cloth simulation in 1997's Jerry's Game, a 5-minute short that was shown before A Bug's Life in theaters. At first, Jerry's baggy suit wouldn't fit with his movement outside of a default T-pose. When he lowered his arms, for example, the fabric bunched up in his armpits. Steve Jobs suggested they ask designer Giorgio Armani for tailoring help. Instead, they came up with a long-term solution, writing a software for a simulator that would govern the jacket's behavior. By 2001's Monsters, Inc., Pixar had set up a dedicated simulation department and built a simulator engine called Fizz-T, which helped control the folding of Boo's loose t-shirt. Fizz-T is the same program used on Onward. It basically functions like a computer, calculating how cloth should realistically respond to a character's movements and surroundings, how it should move with the character's body, and in response to different forces.
For that, we need motion from the animation department on the character. The character animator moves the lower body around like they walk the legs around, and we start simulating it.
But because Dad's upper half is all clothes and no body, simulation played an even more important role than usual.
We had to make him believable, like that it's really all the motion is driving from his hips. Since his arms don't have muscles in them, they just need to kind of flop around, which can be a really challenging thing to animate. There are a bunch of shots in the movie where the entire upper body, the blue vest, the gray sweatshirt, the hands, which are actually just like worked gloves, and the hat and the glasses are all simulated. There's a lot of sort of interplay between the animation and the simulation there, and making it feel both kind of intentional, but also believable that it's not really a person in there.
Since Dad's upper half is basically a lump of stuffing, it required what's called a volumetric sim, a simulation for something that's thick and has volume. To make the stuffing look nice and cushy, they used technology from an unlikely source, the octopus Hank from Finding Dory, a film that Chris actually worked on. The scene that introduced Hank in that movie took a full 2 years to make. And in the final version, a lot of Hank's charm comes from his squishy, squashy motion.
The volumetric simulation, the squishiness of Hank, was the precursor to the squishiness for Dad.
Another beloved Pixar film that Chris worked on, Coco, also helped lay the groundwork for the advanced level of cloth simulation in Onward.
The intense layering of cloth and complexity and detail that we got from Coco made it possible for us to make more complex and interesting characters on Onward. And just the speed of our simulator got a lot better, so Dad wouldn't have been possible without the work that was done on Coco.
As viewers, we have an intuitive understanding for how clothes should move on a body. And if simulation does its job, those cloth dynamics will look natural on screen. But when looking at clothes, we also instinctively know how light should reflect off a certain surface, and where we might see scratches or fraying threads or pilling. That's where we get to the shading, or surfacing, part of the process. When Pixar's shading artists add highly detailed patterns, tints, and finishes to make each garment look true to life, we see a variety of different fabrics on the characters in Onward, and each is treated differently by Pixar's shading artists. They have the advantage of many years of shading technologies, developed for earlier productions like 2012's Brave. Back then, the challenge of shading Marita's period dresses and her father's 16 layers of costume produced what the studio calls loom technology. This program basically weaves every strand of virtual fabric into a shading software, giving clothes richer detail and a more tactile quality. Pixar also made breakthroughs in shading with 2018's Incredibles 2. Since fashion is such a big part of the Incredibles movies, one of Pixar's design goals for the second film was to make their garment shading work better with extreme character movements, like those of the highly kinetic Elastigirl. Pixar developed technology to preserve fine texture and illumination details in the characters' supersuits, even when the fabrics were stretched or compressed. In Onward, shading really helps to sell the textures of the clothes on screen. The shiny leather of Dad's shoes, the fuzziness of his sweatshirt, and the puffiness of his vest. Without any shading work, that vest might look more like plastic than the nylon material it's supposed to be. Once the shading artists get all the materials down, they add signs of wear and tear, like scuff marks on Dad's shoes and subtle stains on his vest. When watching the movie, you probably wouldn't actively notice these touches.
But without them, without those imperfections they're very specific handmade imperfections, it doesn't feel real.
Another way to make the clothes look lived in is through wrinkling, which is usually a collaborative project between the tailoring and shading artists. If we take another look at the vest, those bigger wrinkles and bumps were modeled into the garment by Chris as part of the tailoring process.
The high-frequency detailed wrinkles were done in shading. So the part where you could see the puffiness cinch down into the seams, Those very fine wrinkles are shaded wrinkles.
Wrinkle patterns are customized for each individual garment, depending on what fabric they're supposed to be and where the artistic direction is going.
The wrinkles on the face, we wanted them to be wrinkly enough that they felt like it could be a real sweatshirt, but they couldn't be so wrinkly that it looked like a scary monster. For the tailor, what that means is we think about how the wrinkles should develop. So we'd have a bunch of different head shape poses, head tilt to the left, head tilt to the right, and the transition between those poses to make sure that the wrinkles that we were making felt right.
Once every single garment has the right amount of texture, it should be looking like real-world fabric, which means the clothing process is pretty much complete. All that's left is rendering all of the shots, the final step in Pixar's production pipeline. The more advanced Pixar's cloth simulation gets, the more power is needed to render each shot. Monsters, Inc., for example, required more rendering power than Pixar's 3 previous features combined, partly because of how complex the cloth and fur simulation was relative to earlier films. Luckily, the studio keeps developing newer and faster processors to do the job. It's Pixar's blending of state-of-the-art technology, grounded in hard math and physics, with imaginative fashion and art direction that makes its costume design language so appealing, and lets an outfit like Dad's play its very own role in the storytelling.
Just about every Pixar movie comes with a new advancement, from mastering the way light travels through water to rethinking individual elements like balloons and clouds. Here's how 12 more Pixar movies pushed 3D animation forward.
Pixar moved underwater for Finding Nemo. So the studio had to nail the appearance of light passing through objects in the ocean, like the several thousand jellyfish in this sequence. These jellies called for different shading than any other creature Pixar had worked on. As CG supervisor Lisa Forsell said, the team didn't want the jellyfish to look transparent like a window or translucent like a shower curtain. Their membrane needed to resemble bathroom glass, where you can see through it, but it's all distorted and blurry. So Pixar wrote a whole new shading system called transblurrency, which blurred the background of objects based on their depth and distance from the viewer, calculating camera position and optical light paths into the equation. You can see how the background is most blurred in the middle of the jellyfish and least blurred on the edges of its bell. That's true to the way light refracts through a jellyfish's membrane, and it captures that bathroom window effect they were going for. In real life, a car would look weird if it didn't have any reflections on its surface. But translating this on screen can get complicated, especially for a movie like Cars. See, shiny cars reflect other shiny cars, which makes for a lot of reflections at play in scenes like this one. The only way Pixar could master all these reflective metal surfaces was with ray tracing, a technique of mapping out all the rays of light in a scene as they bounce off walls, objects, and characters. Pixar first used ray tracing in 2 shots of A Bug's Life to create the reflections on a glass bottle. But it only became a main part of the rendering process with Cars, where it was used to create the sharp shadows and detailed reflections the filmmakers needed. Ray tracing transformed animation. It even ended up on CGI elements in live-action movies, like this Transformer or Iron Man's suit. And it set the stage for even more complex lighting in future Pixar movies, like Monsters University. In Ratatouille, all the dishes had to look absolutely delicious. So the shading, art, and lighting teams studied food photography to figure out what exactly makes food look good on camera. They determined that a lot of a dish's visual appeal boils down to the appearance of softness, which comes from light passing through the food. See, a lot of foods are actually kind of translucent, which means some light will go through the surface of the material, scatter around, and then reflect back. Pixar already had a way of replicating this effect, a technique for rendering translucent materials called subsurface scattering. This tool modeled light scattering outwards through the surface of the food. But the filmmakers were still going for a more translucent look and wanted to show light going straight through the food as well. So they developed a new type of light called gummy, based partly on the gummy bear-like quality of Marlin and Nemo in Finding Nemo. Take this shot of cheese, grapes, and bread. The cheese in this first shot has no lighting. With the subsurface scattering, you can see the outer edges and top layers illuminated. And finally, with gummy, the light permeates every layer of the cheese to give it a soft, diffused glow. They used this approach on entire shelves of cheese and vegetables, as well as on liquids like wine. Together, subsurface scattering and gummy created a two-part translucency effect that made sure no food item would look waxy, hard, or plastic on screen. On the old Pixar camera, any tilt or pan was a two-dimensional move, without any change in perspective. But WALL-E's filmmakers wanted the viewer's perspective to shift when the virtual camera did, so it'd feel like the camera was actually moving in space. So they rebuilt their camera system, modeling it on the way an anamorphic camera would move and consulting with a live-action cinematographer, a first for any Pixar film. The first act of the movie went for a loose handheld feel, designed to look like it was shot from a camera operator's shoulder. The second and third acts are supposed to look like they're shot with a Steadicam. And since a camera never moves perfectly in real life, director Andrew Stanton said his team spent probably 90% of their time putting little imperfections into the virtual camera. There are shots where the focus lags, tracking shots with a little bump in the camera movement, and scenes where it feels like the camera person sees something and catches it a few frames later. The result is perfectly imperfect. In Up, Carl's canopy of balloons is central to the storyline. It involved thousands of colorful balloons, each attached to the chimney of Carl's house by a string, with thousands of collisions going on at any given moment. And when one balloon bumped into another, the second one would bump into a third balloon, and so on. At the time, Pixar's physical simulator could only handle about 500 balloons, so the effects department wrote a new program to run under the simulator. Using Newton's laws of motion, the computer accounted for forces acting on the balloons in every shot, and then decided how each balloon should move. It also made sure that all the balloons were buoyant, that their strings were attached, and that the wind was blowing through them in a realistic way, for every single frame of animation. Ultimately, Pixar's simulator was powerful enough to handle 10,297 balloons. The filmmakers behind Cars 2 envisioned it as a Jason Bourne-style spy movie, where the cars would race around cities from London to Tokyo. They wanted to reproduce those settings with a level of detail that was 10 times what Pixar had put into any other film. For one of the movie's biggest sequences, that meant making specific improvements to the way Pixar depicted waves. Technology from Finding Nemo was best suited for calmer waters, but in Cars 2, the filmmakers wanted to show rough, high waves slamming into the sides of the boat. They came up with an ocean generator called Tessendorf, which used algorithms to simulate sharper, cuspier waves that captured the danger of an ocean's choppy surface. With this, Pixar could better convey the physics of the natural world and pushed its water simulation to the next level. In Cars, Pixar used ray tracing in small doses to create reflections and shadows in dynamic scenes with lots of shiny vehicles. But for the vast majority of shots, Pixar's artists still built reflections and mapped out shadows by hand. That changed with Monsters University. The lighting team wanted more time to focus on the artistic rather than the engineering side of lighting, like creating new scare lights for scary monster scenes. To streamline the process, the goal was to ray trace pretty much everything. All the shadows and light refractions, even the reflections in a character's eye. This required an overhaul of the lighting system the studio had used since the first Toy Story. Pixar built a new system called Global Illumination that modeled the natural distribution of light in a scene, all based on real-world physics. Now, every time an artist placed a light source in a shot, the computer would know how that light would travel and interact with other elements, and it would simulate the resulting bright spots, shadows, and reflections. Global illumination became the default lighting system for every Pixar movie, making Pixar's light more closely resemble the kind we see in real life. But this model didn't account for more fantastical scenarios, like we'd see in Inside Out. Joy, the main character of Inside Out, is supposed to resemble a star. She's made up of glowing particles that radiate off her skin. This character had to shed warm, yellow-blue light wherever she appeared in a scene. And the light had to track with her bouncy movement, which wasn't easy since she's literally a ball of energy. So Pixar's RenderMan team came up with an effect they called geometric area lights, or geolight. This tool allowed lighting artists to select a character model and turn it into a mobile light source. That way, Joy's light could travel with her. If she walks up to a prop, she projects her glow on it. And she casts light onto other characters too, like this pivotal scene with Sadness. Her light was also accurate to her body structure. For example, when she picks something up, we see the light emanate through her fingers. This made the outward glow look more believable, taking Pixar's lighting system yet another step forward. Nature plays a bigger role in The Good Dinosaur than in any other Pixar film, so the filmmakers really needed to nail the landscape of the American Northwest. They were especially focused on the huge, constantly changing clouds they observed on a research trip. Traditionally, Pixar movies used matte-painted clouds, meaning the artist would paint clouds onto background plates. But The Good Dinosaur took place entirely outside, with clouds in almost every scene. So they decided for the first time to create entirely volumetric clouds. That meant these clouds were 3D objects animators could move around, like a character or a key set piece. But unlike a character or set, a volumetric object has no defined surface. It's just made up of billions of tiny particles. The Clouds team built a huge library of what they called cloud Lego parts. They joined these volumetric forms together to create huge clouds of every type: rain clouds, stratus clouds, and cumulus clouds. With the clouds actually in the scene, viewers can move in and around the 3D forms as the camera moves, making this world that much more immersive. The filmmakers behind the third Cars movie wanted to emphasize the aging details on hero characters, like the older racer Louise Nash. Any car's surface is composed of multiple layers: metal flake paint with a clear coating, car stickers, dirt, grime, and mud composited on top. But traditionally, when Pixar showed an object with detailed texture from a more distant shot, all the little details would merge into a single pixel, making the object's surface look too smooth. So Pixar developed a technology called bump roughness mapping, which converts what looks like bumps up close into surface roughness in farther away shots. Louise, for example, keeps the texture of her clear coat scratches even in medium and wide shots. And this tech wasn't only applicable to cars. Pixar could use the bump roughness method to preserve details in all kinds of 3D objects. The fourth Toy Story brought up issues of scale, thanks to all the scenes set in the antique store, and thus all the toys. There were over 10,000 antiques in this store, and Pixar had to find a way to program each and every one with varying levels of wear and tear. Animators tackled this challenge by assigning 3 different ages to the antiques: fairly new, moderately aged, and extremely aged. The computer then gave the items surface details that fit those ages, from micro scratches on china platters to wear and tear on old rugs. The ability to add detail to so many different objects is what gave the world of Toy Story 4 its visual complexity and appeal. Luca is a coming-of-age story about a sea monster who can transform into a human, and the filmmakers needed to show this transformation in a fluid way. They also wanted to give animators the power to dictate all the details of that change, such as where the transformation begins and the speed at which it happens. Before, adjustments to those kinds of details would have to go through animation, then go to the effects team, and only then would animators get to see how it all looked after rendering. But for Luca, they created a transformation rig, so animators could fine-tune the different aspects of the change one by one and see the result right there in front of them. That way, they could perfectly time the transition, from the layers of changes in the human skin to the flipping scales and octopus spots in the sea monster skin. This was a new way to streamline the whole production process and put more artistic control in the hands of animators. After all, Pixar views technology first and foremost as a storytelling tool. Whether creating a new kind of light to better convey a character's emotions, or rethinking cloud models to give audiences a stronger sense of place, Pixar's technical innovations have always served its stories first. And that's the key to the studio's record of creating both groundbreaking innovations and beloved movies.